The Evening Show with Simon Rose on Share Radio.
Now I'm joined by Pete Comley, who's written in the past a couple of books on personal finance, but has today published on Amazon the Kindle edition of his new book, Inflation Matters. And it certainly does, as far as today is concerned. The Chancellor tells us it's all down to him, that we've seen CPI inflation go to the lowest in modern times, 0.5%. Anyway, Pete, welcome.
Yes, and it's great to be here, Simon, and also congratulations to Share Radio. I extend my welcome along with everyone else. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
Have a new radio station.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, you have become an expert in inflation, something you've been studying with a long time. It's the second book you've written about inflation. We've known each other for a while. When we were speaking about inflation sort of 2-3 years ago, of course, what everybody's then worried about was that the £375 billion worth of quantitative easing, this money that the Bank of England had magicked up, was going to actually produce inflation numbers that were going to take us through the roof. We had inflation going through 5%, and we were worried it might go higher. That hasn't actually happened. So what has happened?
What has happened? I think what's interesting about inflation, and one of the things that sort of got me hooked on being interested about it, is looking back into the history of it. And if you look back in over time, and by time I mean back over the millennia, you see that prices have been continually going up. And in fact, they were going up even in Roman times and Babylonian times. But what's fascinating is that they don't go up in a straight line. They go up in a wave-like fashion. And the waves last about 200 or 300 years. And we are in one of those waves now, and we're almost at the peak of inflation. And what seems to be driving inflation over the long term is population growth and competition for resources. And why we see this wave-like fashion, it's very much like any other financial products, really. When man starts to spot that prices are going off, he starts exploiting that inflation wave and buying assets that might retain their value, like houses and shares, and then more money gets printed and creates more inflation, and the whole thing carries on in a vicious cycle until some point is reached when there's suddenly a tipping point and things start to consolidate. And I reckon we're very close to that consolidation point now. And the main reason for that is that, bearing in mind the underlying driver here is population growth and resource competition, is that the population around the world is starting to slow. It's aging significantly. Replacement birth rates are much lower in all developed markets now. It's only really Africa where it's growing. Yes. And yet, on the other hand, we've still got massive production going on.
You point out in the book that inflation really has hit the UK harder since World War II.
Yes.
Over the course of my lifetime, I think using the official RPI statistic which we can't use because the CPI doesn't go back far enough, essentially the pound's lost about 97% of its value. It's quite extraordinary. And if we look back over, yes, we have low inflation now, but if we look back over 5 years, then the CPI figure shows about 14.5% rise and RPI 18.7%. And over 10 years, we've seen a rise of 30% in CPI and a rise of 36% in the RPI. Now, Dr. Tim Morgan, who has been a guest on the evening show, while he was with his previous employer, Tullett Prebon, calculated a sort of essentials index, because one of the things I know you're going to talk about in a moment is the fact that people's experience often is that rising prices seem to them to be climbing higher than the inflation index will usually say. Inflation feels more severe to most people than the official numbers. Now, so he calculated the essentials index, which is essentially taking 8 things that people cannot do without.
Yes.
And over 5 years, while CPI was up 14.5%, he reckons its essentials went up 23%. And over the 10-year period, while CPI was showing a 30% rise, he reckons that essentials had more than, almost doubled, at nearly 60%. Now, obviously, essentials in the last few months have been doing rather better.
In the opposite direction, I'd say.
But obviously, inflation is a sort of cumulative thing.
Is.
It's not, so far, at any rate, we are still seeing rising prices. We are not seeing the dreaded deflation.
That's right. Or whether it is dreaded deflation, and we could come back. We could come back to that in a minute, really.
But you talk in the book about how governments always underestimate inflation. I mean, why is that? So it's not just that people seem to feel that inflation is higher than they're telling us. You actually feel it is.
Basically, calculating inflation is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And I take my hats off to the guys at ONS who try and do this, because you have to take lots of decisions in order to calculate. You might just think it's a simple case of just finding out what people purchase and going off and monitoring those products and seeing what the prices are in the shops, and next month having a look at them. But it's actually more complicated than that. You've got to decide, well, what products are we going to monitor? And then once we've got them, how are we going to deal with the fact that people's purchasing habits change over time? And also, how do we even add those figures together and compare them? And all of the decisions that you take on those three variables impact on the number of inflation that you create at the end of the day. And when you go to politicians with a set of different options, well, we could do it this way, we could do it that way, there is always going to be a temptation to select the one that happens to produce the lowest number. And all one can say is that if you look around the world, there is quite a lot of evidence for that. I mean, even the Economist a couple of years ago was running various articles like "Don't Lie to Me, Argentina," and I think they were using their Bergonomics thing to determine how much countries around the world were lying over their inflation.
This is comparing the price of a Big Mac in all the different countries around the world.
Yes, exactly. And it very much indicated that in most countries the official inflation rates were indeed underestimating it.
Difficult to tell, because you can't just as a statistician say, well, it feels to me as if it should be. You've actually got to provide some proof. But we've had several different inflation rates, haven't we? I mean, that's the problem. We always used to have RPI. That was felt to be good enough for many years. Then CPI was introduced because that way we could compare our price rises with Europe. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very... I mean, RPI... the first price indices in this country started back around the First World War, because they were aware that prices were going to go up then, and they needed to ensure that workers were dealt with properly. And our whole of our price indices got revised again after the Second World War, which is where IPI came from. CPI, the history of that is actually quite interesting, because that all goes back to the Maastricht Treaty in around about 1996, in order to be able to determine whether countries were eligible to join the euro. They had to comply with having a stable rate of inflation that wasn't that different to other ones. So Europe created a new index called Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices.
Flows off the tongue.
Flows off the tongue, right? Yeah. And they asked all of the member countries to create this alongside their existing measure. And when they created it, they couldn't actually agree on a whole load of details between them, because it's Europe and they can't agree. For one of the examples, they couldn't agree on how to deal with housing, so they just left it out and didn't put it in there, right?
Okay.
One of the other problems they had was that they needed to have a consistent levels of pricing that didn't change much and that wasn't that different between nations. So it was very tempting to use a type of mean score called a geometric mean, which tends to be lower and more consistent. So they used that. And what happened is that after they started using it, countries realised that this measure was often quite a bit lower than their existing measure. Like Gordon Brown spotted that, and by 2003 he said to the Bank of England, "Oh, stop using RPI. No, start using this Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices." But he realised that he couldn't call it that, so he renamed it CPI. So
it's a shame, because the acronym would probably be HICCUP, which I think would be much more entertaining.
Which is about what it is. But that measure that was created by Europe was never, ever intended to be a cost of living index. It was purely there to allow comparisons, and they didn't really... Yes, they didn't really care that it didn't really measure accurately what was going on. They just wanted to be able to compare it across countries. And indeed, in places like Germany, they still carry on measuring inflation as they always did, and they produce this number for Europe and give them the figures, but they do their own stuff, thank you very much. And they've not... We are really unusual to have adopted that as our national statistic, and it comes with a lot of problems, like, where's the housing? Housing's not in it.
Now, many people, being slightly cynical of our governments and statisticians, claim that when the government has to pay us money, they will use the CPI, which tends to be lower than the RPI, and when we have to pay them money, as with cost of rail fares or various other thing, they will use the RPI. Is that unduly cynical, or is that pretty much the way it seems to be?
All I can say is that's the way it seems to me as well.
Okay.
And
so we have the RPI, and then we have the CPI, and then recently we've had Paul Johnson of the Institute of Fiscal Studies saying really we shouldn't be using either of them. RPI because it's completely outmoded, CPI because it doesn't, as you say, include housing. So he's suggesting we use the CPIH measure, which does include housing. Is that right? So what do you think about all this? I mean, it's already getting terribly confusing, because if people want actually to know what the cost of living is, we'd like just to be using one index, really, wouldn't we?
We would like to be using one index. I must admit, I found the proposal to use CPIH quite surprising, really, because CPIH is the H stands for housing. So you think, okay, well, they've added in all the housing elements. So they've added in mortgages, they've added in house prices, they've added in ground rent, they've added in council tax and all that stuff. Have they? No. What's in CPIH is some strange estimate of rental equivalence, and it doesn't have any of that in. And in fact, it's a very strange number. I'm not even sure where it comes from, but it always ends up estimating that the owner-occupiers' costs in this country are going up by about 1% or less, which means that if you add that into CPI, except in this last month when inflation has gone below 1%, it's meant that it's actually been lowering CPI. So CPIH has been a method of actually lowering inflation still further. So
because RPI, the old-fashioned and now much maligned index that statisticians tell us we should not use, that did include housing costs, did it?
Quarter of that index is housing cost. That's how big and how important housing is in terms of what we are doing. I mean, if you think about it, any price index, you want it to cover what the average person spends in this country.
Yes.
And in fact, naively, if you tried to create an ideal index from scratch, you would just interview a sample of the population, find out what they're spending their money on, and then you would check those items and you'd monitor them over time. But CPI doesn't do that. In fact, with CPI, the way it weights them together, it doesn't weight them together in terms of how much people purchase them. It actually uses the numbers out of the government GDP accounts. So those are actually expenditure weighted. Sorry, not wishing to get into the details, but basically what that means is that they are then biased to the purchasing of the wealthy. I mean, just to give you an example, in CPI, eating out accounts for 10% of CPI index. It's only 5% of the nation's expenditure. Well, alcoholic drinks, well, seeing we're a country of alcoholic drinkers, accounts for 6% of most people's expenditure, but only 2% for CPI. So there's a lot of reasons why CPI isn't really that great a measure. I mean, the reason the statisticians all love it is that it uses this strange way of combining the mean scores together, which gets around some of the other problems of the other ways of combining them together.
So, okay, and an explanation then of why perhaps CPI doesn't reflect many people's real cost of living.
Exactly.
The Evening Show on Share Radio.
Hi, I'm Simon Rose. I'm talking to Pete Comley about his new book, Inflation Matters. The subheading we'll come to in a minute is Inflationary Wave Theory, its impact on inflation past and present, and the deflation yet to come. But before we leave inflation behind and look at what the future might hold, so who are the real people to benefit, and who are the people who actually were disadvantaged by inflation? Especially if we're looking back over 10 years and we're talking about prices going up on the two measures we've been using, either 30 or 36%.
I mean, I think what one has to realise about inflation is that it has become a lot more dangerous since 2008, since the world of financial repression came about and the government has forced interest rates down. Any form of inflation now is having a massive effect on anyone who holds cash, anyone who's got any savings of any sort, anyone who's got a pension, i.e. with bonds in it. And all of those people are effectively what the inflation is doing is transferring wealth from those people directly into the hands of anyone with any form of debt. And that's primarily governments, mortgage holders, companies, and finance companies. Those people are... And the size of the transfer, I mean, in the book I try and do some calculations with, before the latest inflation figures, which have come down, but it was around about £100 billion in the UK alone is being transferred from those people across to the debtors. It's as I said, this is just like a conveyor belt, and the money is just going. The billions are going across this conveyor belt every day.
My previous job was working for Save Our Savers. This was something we were trying to get across to people, and we reckoned that in 5 years, taking into account both the drop in interest rates but also the effects of inflation, we calculated about £320 billion had been transferred effectively from savers to borrowers. Extraordinary transfer. I mean, that's almost as much as the government spent. As the Bank of England spent on quantitative easing, itself considered to be quite a phenomenal sum.
And what I think is, is the biggest impact is how much the reduced value of people's savings, or the purchasing power that has happened over the last few years. I mean, again, I did some calculations in there that the average person has probably lost about 15% of the purchasing power of their money in any form of savings over the last 5 years. And what I find staggering is that in Cyprus, when the government tried to take away something like 8% from people, they were out on the street and building the barricades. And,
there was worldwide condemnation. There was condemnation in our press as well.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. But what about in this country? People are just... They've just taken it, and they haven't realised. I mean, that to me is the pernicious thing about inflation, is you don't realise what it's doing. It's eroding cash and money.
Okay, but we now appear to be entering a period when inflation is more quiescent. Mark Carney, the governor, is now going to have to write a letter to the Chancellor. The first governor to have to write a letter to the Chancellor explaining why inflation is too low, because 1 to 3% is the band they're allowed to keep it within. So what do you think he's going to be saying? We're not going to find out for another week or two, I don't think.
Well, if you look... In the past, Mervyn King had to write about half a dozen letters to the chancellors explaining why inflation was too high, and they virtually always said, well, it's out of my control, it's all to do with commodity prices and exchange rates, and also your government increases in prices that like VAT rises, that I can't do anything about. And indeed, to some extent, his answer will probably be very similar now, that it's all to do with commodity prices. I mean, as we know, it's mainly driven down by oil prices, but we've also had decreases in soft commodity prices as well over the last year. We've had corn down about half, and soybeans, and so all of those things are feeding through. But to be honest, if I was Mark Carney, I'd be radical. I'd say to the Chancellor, let's change the target. We have a target of 2%. Why don't we make it less than 2%? Because indeed, if you go back, the original target which Norman Lamont created in 1992 for this country was exactly that. The target would be less than 2%. It was only when Gordon Brown came in and he immediately edited that target to be, we're going to have a precise target of 2.5%.
Okay, because when economists talk about stable prices, they don't mean stable prices you or I would think about it. They mean 2% usually, and essentially that is taking away 2% of your money every year. But of course that's a great benefit to those people who are in debt, and of course the biggest debtor of all is the government.
Correct.
But what is happening now? If we are moving towards a period where either we don't get rising prices, or we might even get what economists seem to be terrified of, deflation, whereas I suspect you or I would be quite happy if prices go down. But this is then terrifying them, particularly because of the debt burden, both, I guess, private debt but also government debt.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few reasons why they're so terrified about it. Debt is clearly one of them, because obviously if the real prices, if prices in the country go down and your wages go down and your profits go down and your taxation goes down, that means that you've still got to service the same size of the debt. And what's happened with deflation is that conveyor belt that was churning that 100 billion across from savers to borrowers starts going in the opposite direction. and obviously they are very frightened about that. But will it have a big difference? I don't know. I mean, I'll tell you what was interesting is during the 1980s and 1990s, inflation in this country came down from nearly 20% down to virtually zero around the millennium. And so therefore the burden on companies for servicing their debts went up proportionally. There were no higher defaults by 2000 than there was in 1980. So in other words, this argument that, it makes it, the burden going up will create more defaults for companies, I just don't seem to hold in real life.
Many economists also seem to believe that if prices are falling, that people will stop spending. We live in an economy which is very heavily dependent upon consumer spending. All this talk about rebalancing the economy, it hasn't happened at all. I think 2/3 of all economic activity is supposed to come from household spending.
Yeah.
So obviously it would be worrying if people stopped spending, but I mean, do you actually believe that if prices start falling, people will delay expenditure much?
I think this is probably one of the biggest sort of fallacies in economics, actually. I mean, if you look around, I mean, certainly the thing that has driven CPI inflation lower today is decreases in petrol prices and decreases in food prices in the shops. Neither of which can I delay purchasing. If my car runs out of petrol, I've got to fill it up. If I run out of King Edward's potatoes, I'm not going to wait for them to go down from £1 down to 90p to buy another bag. And even if they did it, the world doesn't work like that. There's another rule of economics to do with price elasticity, which has been known for decades and decades, that if the price of something goes down 10%, sales of it go up 10%. That's why we have sales. That's why people... I mean, when you think about it, in the New Year sales, what shops do is they reduce prices slightly at the beginning of the sale, and then they gradually increase the reductions as the sale goes on. Most people go into the sales right at the beginning. They don't delay to the end to get a cheaper price. This is a complete fallacy. I mean, and cheaper prices, I mean, if cheaper prices didn't stimulate greater sales, we wouldn't have Primark, we wouldn't have Poundlands and all these other, and Lidl, they wouldn't be there. So, I mean, there can be a time when prices go down where people might delay purchasing, but it's very unlikely at the small levels we're talking about here. If there was a major recession like the 1930s, but to be honest, what went on in the 1930s wasn't deflation that stopped people buying stuff then. It was a financial crisis that caused a massive destruction of wealth and also lack of confidence. And it was the lack of confidence of people in the 1930s that changed what technically economists would call the velocity of money. Basically, people didn't want to spend. They had to save because they were so scared.
Yes.
And so it wasn't, and the deflation was an outcome. It wasn't the cause of the problems at that time. So there's a lot of things that I think are in mainstream economics that don't quite stack up with the reality.
Now in your book, you've got you say a new theory of inflation, inflationary wave theory. We've only got really just a couple of minutes. Possibly not very easy to summarise it in a couple of minutes, but if you can, just give us a hint of what that's about, what people can read about in the book.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning I was telling you that there's this broad uptrend of prices over the millennia, and you have, and where we've got at the moment, prices started rising in this country around 1900. The up part of the inflationary wave typically lasts around 100 years, plus or minus 20 or 30 years. We're 115 years into it at the moment. The chances are that we will hit that consolidation point. I don't think we're there at the moment. You might think inflation's down to 0.5%, but we're not. There's a whole number of conditions that need to happen. And also, one of the things that history also shows us is there's usually a deflationary shock that happens. Prices decline by a half during a period of a few years. That is the tipping point and the start of this consolidation period.
You think we may be approaching that?
At some point, I can't tell you when, and I can't tell you what's going to cause it, but at some point in the next couple of decades, we will have one of those, and that will then. So I wouldn't surprise.
And very difficult to invest in that sort of world as well.
I think you have to realise that you've got to look at. You've got to be flexible here. Up until that point happens, central banks are going to do absolutely everything they can to ensure that inflation keeps going. So that's going to support asset prices like shares and housing. But the minute we hit that transition point, wealth gets destroyed in a massive way. It would be my guess.
Yeah, savers would argue that has already been happening substantially. But
it's a different group.
Yes.
And in fact, one of the key implications is that we'll end up with greater equality, and indeed, in the book I talk about, Piketty, who did great work, but he only looked at what's happened in the last wave over the last couple of hundred years. Had he looked at wider, he'd have realised that actually it's just part of an inflationary cycle.
Okay, I have been talking to Pete Comley. His book which is out today on Amazon, Inflation Matters, Inflationary Wave Theory, Its Impact on Inflation Past and Present, and the Deflation Yet to Come. Pete, so how do people get hold of the book easily?
Well, in addition to being able to buy a copy on Amazon, it is coming out in hardback, but my print-on-demand printers haven't quite got there yet, so it's going to be another couple of weeks. Just go to Amazon. But the other thing you could do is that I'm also making a light version of it available, which has got the first 7 chapters,